Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. Following his time as Attorney General and his brother's death, Bobby Kennedy became a senator and then began running for president before he was gunned down in 1968. Charting Kennedy's story from AG to his assassination is not just the normal story of a politician's rise, but it's also the story of a politician's awakening to the suffering of many in America, an America that looks a lot like the one we live in today. Let's take a look at the trailer for Don Porter's Bobby Kennedy for President on Netflix.
What I think is quite clear is there is division, violence, and a disenchantment with our society. We can start to work together. We are a great country and a compassionate country.
President Kennedy has been shot.
I kept saying to myself, what is happening in America?
Robert Kennedy's self-confidence came from his family.
From Ethel emerged a moral center. Unlike most guys with his power, he was a great father.
I think makes it worthwhile is you make the right kind of an effort. You can have an effect on their lives.
The Kennedys were in the middle of a transitional moment for America.
He had learned you didn't do things that you weren't going to win. But the new politics said you do the cause, whether you win or not.
There is a new generation going to take over here in the United States, and this country is going to move ahead.
It was stressed in our family that because we had these tremendous advantages, we had a responsibility.
Somebody outside said, are you going to serve your whole 6 years? I don't know where I'd go. Frankly, I don't need the money, and I don't need the office space. I'd like to just be a good United States Senator. I'd like to serve.
We face a major crisis in the Mississippi Delta.
I asked him to go and see. Nobody was going to believe. People were starving in America. It was clearly he'd gone through a transformation.
Robert Kennedy went home so upset about it. He banged his fist on the table and he pointed at every one of his children. You have to do something about this.
There is today an alien land within our borders.
These are people suffering that have changed.
Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair comes wisdom. I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
Everybody, please welcome producer, director, writer of Bobby Kennedy for President, Don Porter. Thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on this incredible work.
Thank you.
Very well done. It's a lot about Bobby Kennedy we didn't know, and then a lot about him we knew but put into a new context.
Yeah, you know, it felt like a good time to explore our history and to talk about a leader who was not only smart and compassionate and strategic, but also compassionate and empathetic. I think we all feel like we could use that in our leadership these days.
But also not someone who started out that way, which is what one of the very smart things that I think this documentary does, this series.
You know, one of the things that attracted me to this story is I think sometimes we have the misimpression that people have always been this way. They were all, you know, like they sprang fully formed as civil rights heroes. And in the Bobby Kennedy story, what you see is someone who had to be pushed and encouraged, but you know, when people came to push him, he listened. Not always happily, but he did listen.
Or so often I think what happens is we get bogged down in the cynicism of those who say, an opinion has changed because it's been politically expedient for the candidate or the person that's running. For instance, when Barack Obama came around and said that he was for gay marriage,
right,
a lot of the criticism was, well, now this is just because it's politically expedient.
Right.
But it actually doesn't matter.
Right. Well, right. If you do the right thing, you do the right thing. So, but I think that that's actually a perfect example. But it's also one of the differences between press coverage back in the 1960s and press coverage today. Because we cover everybody's cough and hiccup, you know, we think if they change their minds, you know, the first thing we do is we research every single word that they've ever said. You know, being not kind of out in public all the time allowed Bobby Kennedy to have conversations, to have meetings, to have interactions, and to think and to grow and change. And that's the story of, particularly in the 1960s.
And just to add to that about press coverage now versus then, briefly, or tangentially, I think that we also have the constant conflict within our press coverage now. Like if someone does one thing, they're immediately looking for the contrary opinion to add conflict to the fire. Whereas I don't know necessarily if the press did that as much then.
I don't know. I think what was really, so I used to work at ABC News. And one of the things, I had this friend in the tape library. It's always good to have a friend in the tape library. But one of the things he said to me was, we have all this footage that's in cans, and it hasn't been digitized, and it's like, 1968. And I was like, oh, I really want to know what's in those cans. So the news networks back at that time were starting this to cover things not just as perfect little packages, but they were starting to do this more verite kind of let's follow me around kind of coverage. And because of that, we do have, so much more of an archive, a film archive. And they were shooting on film. They were shooting news packages on film. So one of the exercises we did was to go through, we went through 2,000 reels of film to do this. So it was pretty fun to be like immersed in the late 50s, early 60s that way. Late 50s, I didn't want to live through them. It was nice to see them on film, though. But the 60s is such a, exciting time. And, just all of it. The clothes, the politics, the chaos,
The footage is beautiful. All of the footage that you have found is really incredible. And I love that you do get to see it go from black and white to color. In an almost seamless transition, though. It doesn't feel like at no point the series is like, now we're in color. It's just suddenly you're in a color,
like
a
Bewitched,
colorful world.
like now we're in color.
Yeah. What was it like combing through all of those? And is that how you wrote the story, or did you write the story before and then go and look for the footage?
It was really a combination. But what I wanted to do is have the archive tell the story as much as possible, so that people could feel immersed in the time. But the other thing I feel like, and I feel like this with all my films, is I might have an opinion, but I try and give people enough of an insight, use enough material so they can make their own opinions. So something might strike you that didn't strike the next person, but that's what's great about the medium. So the first thing we did was we sent this incredible archivist out, and he kind of scoured, there's a ton of Bobby Kennedy footage, but I wanted to have stuff that wasn't necessarily seen before, but also it wasn't just that, it was to what material can we get that gives us some insight into his thinking and that allows us to see, how do you go from being kind of neutral on civil rights to breaking Cesar Chavez's fast with Dolores Huerta, to calling a jail to get Martin Luther King out of jail, to explaining to an audience in Indianapolis that Martin Luther King had died. Bobby Kennedy did all of those things, but he didn't start out as that activist guy.
And how do you go from standing in front of the Chamber of Commerce, telling them that welfare is the thing that drives families
apart,
apart and breaks them down, and we need to get them off welfare, to someone who isn't necessarily supporting welfare later, but is supporting sort of equal rights and equal pay?
Yeah, I think his understanding of, and this is something I admire, not necessarily a stand on welfare, but I think examining and thinking what he believed was that people need dignity and people need jobs. So I think he later came to appreciate the social safety net a great deal more. So one of the things he does is he invites a young woman, Marion Wright, who would become Marion Wright Edelman and become the president of the Children's Defense Fund. But before that, she was this young woman in her 20s, a lawyer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And he invites her to Congress to test. He's a senator from New York. He invites her to Congress to testify about hunger and poverty in Mississippi. And she goes and she says, well, why don't you come down and see it for yourself? I can tell you about it, but come see. And he does, and he brings the press, but he doesn't use it as just a photo op. He goes back to Washington and insists the Department of Agriculture bring food to people in Mississippi. And that to me is, a lot of politicians would say, this is a big problem, let's all have a bunch of hearings about it. And he said, let's have a bunch of hearings about it, but while we're doing that, let's send food to people who have distended bellies and are starving in America. That is not acceptable in America. They can't wait for us to have hearings.
I want to say one thing about that footage that is kind of lighthearted. She looks so damn cool.
Doesn't she look great?
In all of that footage.
Like those pants, those like 1960s pants, and then the dress, and she's got the daisy dress on. She's like smoking on the plane. Yeah, I love.
She looks so
the
cool.
clothes in all of this is so like the clothes are good. All of them like have good clothes. Yeah, she does.
Did you get when you were going through this footage, and I know that so much of the documentary is about his path to becoming a sort of compassionate leader, especially in regards to the poor. But there is something about Bobby Kennedy while watching it for the most part that feels somewhat distant and removed from so many of the instances. I mean, I know that is like a personal reflection on it and not, or a personal observation and not factual in any way. But while you were watching it, there is something about him that feels slightly removed from everything. Did you get that as well?
Yeah,
sometimes?
no, I did. I mean, I think when you're born to such a prominent family and your life is constantly being examined, I think that you get this kind of distance, in public in particular. Everyone wants to know you. Everyone wants a little piece of things. So I think you kind of grow this. It's not a shell, but it's a persona, a persona. So for Bobby Kennedy, what then was important, because originally I thought, could we do it all in archives? But it's that quality that you are pointing to that I felt like there's not a lot where we really feel like we're inside, even, and we listened to like a bunch of hours of his audio tapes, but those felt very scripted. And I was like, I don't want to like be a Wikipedia, So that's
There's a couple moments where he cracks jokes on stage.
Well,
that
he's
are
really funny. He's really funny, and I felt like there you get some insight. But I think the commentary by the people who worked with him and worked for him, like there we tried to kind of bring in some more 3 dimensions, like to him as a person, which I feel like. It's also their story. It's a story of like Marion Wright, like working in Mississippi, meeting a guy named Peter Edelman, who she marries, who's an aide to Bobby Kennedy. It's people who worked with him who were like there in this completely chaotic time in history. And they were idealists, and they were smart, and they were committed, and they did the best they could, And I think like for all of us now, sometimes we feel overwhelmed and we feel like, well, I can't fix that. That problem's too big. And you just got to start where you can, You're like, you don't have to fix it all, but could you be part of one bit of it, one piece of it?
Would you say that time, which felt overwhelming and chaotic, was more overwhelming? I mean, obviously, you weren't necessarily like the same age now. But would you say it was more overwhelming and chaotic then than it is now? Aren't the same sort of things still happening in this country? We just have an easier way to ignore it.
Yeah, I think it was in some ways it was quite similar. I mean, you have to think there's the Vietnam War is going on, and so you have a lot of people very angry and upset, and facing real danger. I mean, there's a piece in the film where Johnson says he's going to have to increase the draft to 36,000 people a month. 36,000 men, young boys, are being sent to Vietnam, per month. If you're a kid with your parent with a teenager, or you're that teenager, you think, my kid's going to war, going to this bloody war, So that's happening. People are upset about that. Then you have
for like for the Vietnam War for like
years.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ken Burns. How many hours did he do? It went on for all those years. So, then you have
that documentary was as long as the war itself. I love that documentary. Sorry.
I do too. But it was like it was in real time, you know.
Yeah.
But, you know, and then you have like civil rights, you know, you have like, and you also have that moment in civil rights where the old guard civil rights, the Martin Luther Kings and, you know, John Lewis, the new guards, like the Stokely Carmichaels, they were like, you know, forget this. So there's all this pressure and civil strife. So I think it was a very active time, and like, you know, chaos was kind of real and immediate. I think today, I think the role of the media, because we have social media, we don't necessarily get a break. You know, if you want to check Facebook to see if your best friend posted her child's baby pictures, you also get Trump did whatever he did today. So,
or you get some sort of somewhat self-righteous claim about something that is like upsetting as well, be it from the right or the left, you know?
And then, you know, we're all like, we have no time. And there's like 2 hours later on Twitter, like, you know. So
it's nice to know that someone who just finished a 4-part series on Netflix also suffers from the same debilitating time things that I have as well.
My husband's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I just need to read this.
My partner's like that as well. What are you doing? I'm on Twitter. Give me that thing.
I know. He's like, are you tweeting? I'm like, no, I'm reading Twitter. So.
Does it feel, is this an oversimplification to say in some ways that we are dealing with a kind of changing of the guard right now in our country, and Trump in a lot of ways? I mean, this is an obvious comparison that everybody's been making since he started his campaign, but very Nixonian, and all of these sort of issues that were kind of coming to the forefront underneath the Obama administration, oftentimes because he was bringing them to the forefront for everybody to talk about, are kind of being washed away because we're in the midst of what, not just the porn stars, but also a Watergate-like investigation.
Right. You know, I think that that is a question. I think that
yes,
from what I've been told, what I do think, you know, and it's interesting you say changing of the guard, because there's several different changing of the guards happening, right? So there was a political shift, you know, from Obama to the current occupant of the White House, but also from, you know, traditional civil rights leaders to Black Lives Matter, to the Parkland kids, you know, to the people who were like protesting about the Pulse shootings. So there's this generational shift that is also happening. And I think that that's healthy, and that's good, and is encouraging. So, you know, there's a lot about the Trump presidency that is, you know, really frightening, and it's not just the policy positions. I would not lie awake, terrified at night, if Mitt Romney was president. I would think there's a person who's, you know, thoughtful. I might disagree, but I would think he was thoughtful. So. I don't think he's, whatever, you know, insert. He's not going to do all the things that we think Trump might do at any moment.
He's not going to call Fox News at 7:30 in the morning and scream for 15 to 20 minutes and then get pulled off air by anchors because he's embarrassing the network.
The only good thing about that is that they couldn't cut him off. So we were like, roll tape. Just yes, yes, yes. You know.
The best thing about that was their faces from the beginning of the interview to the end of the interview. The beginning was like, we have the president. And the end of the interview was like,
we had the president.
Get him off.
And now he's going to want to do it every day. Because, you know, he was like, that was great, right? That was great.
We're like, it wasn't that great.
Not great.
Nope, it was great.
Not that great. So, yes. But I think, you know, I don't know that there's a shift. Like, you know, I think like we were talking about earlier, what I do think it did is it said to people like me, to everybody, you know, democracy is not a spectator sport. Like, you got to be involved. You have to you are responsible for what you want to see happen. And whether that takes its expression as marching in the streets, or even just, you know, paying attention to what your kids are learning in school, telling your kids their opinions, your opinions about things, learning, inviting young people into your life, inviting people, you know, making sure you're actually reading a newspaper and understanding, voting, you know, and I hate to tell you, serving on juries, you know, that stuff is really important.
I've always enjoyed serving on juries.
I love serving on juries.
So do I. It gets a little long, but the first couple days are really fun.
Are really good. When I was in law school, I was a first-year law student, and I got called for jury service, and I was like, yes! You know, my boyfriend at the time was like, you're crazy. So I get there, and they do the questions, and they're like, so you're in law school. Do you have any opinions about the Supreme Court? I'm like, yes, Supreme Court is much too conservative, and blah, blah, blah. And they were like, next.
Goodbye.
Right. So then the next time, they were like, do you have any opinions? And I was like, no. And they were like, you have no opinion? I was like, not strong opinions, no. And then I got on a jury, and then, we deliberated for like days over this really simple case.
I only had one juror incident, and the question was, this is about a gypsy cab driver who potentially got roughed up by a police officer. Do you think you'd be more likely to side with the gypsy cab officer? And I was like, yeah. Yes. They're like, what do you mean? I was like, I don't know. Even if a cop didn't do anything that bad, I'm probably going to side with the gypsy cab driver so he can get some money from the state. They're like, okay, you can go.
Yeah, you're done.
Yeah. So. Going back to your documentary that you made.
No, I have some other family stories.
What was the thing that you found, that blew you away the most about Bobby Kennedy that you didn't know before going into it?
There were a few things. I mean, knowing that he had, he invited James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry. It's like the equivalent of inviting Black Lives Matter over. Like he was like, why don't you come over and let's talk about civil rights?
That's kind of what you just said as well about what people can do, which is inviting others into your life and hearing their stories. He seemed, and that you get a lot of that in the documentary, he seemed absolutely dedicated, almost first and foremost to that.
Yeah, and I think that was, it was really interesting to me he didn't invite King and the NAACP, and so we're talking about this generational shift. He was looking forward. He invited artists and activists and people who would tell an unvarnished truth, and they did, and he didn't like it, and he was very angry about it. But Harry Belafonte tells this story, he thought about it, and it really pushed him to think, we've got to change kind of the if we're going to approach the Black community, we have to earn their votes. We can't take those votes for granted. So, seeing that, seeing Bobby Kennedy called when Martin Luther King had done some sit-ins and so was arrested. And, what's an appropriate penalty for doing a sit-in? It's hard labor. He was sentenced to hard labor on a chain gang for sitting in at a Mississippi lunch counter. So, JFK does the what was thought of as like political suicide by calling Coretta Scott King. Just calling King's pregnant wife to say, we hope that your husband is okay. His aides were apoplectic. His aides and his brother, Bobby, they were like, you've lost the election. The Southern governors will not support you if you even look like you're supporting King. So Bobby Kennedy takes that position, and then over the course of the day, he just gets more and more angry at thinking of King on a chain gang for sitting at a lunch counter. And so he calls the jail, and he actually gets King out of jail. And there's some footage from King coming out of jail, and that's some of the footage that hasn't been seen a bit before. But that act, because he did the moral right thing instead of the politically expedient thing, it literally brings the Black activist over to the Kennedy camp. It brings Black people to begin to vote for Kennedys, and probably, gave Kennedy the election. So history is changed because of that instance of doing, what I think is the right thing.
But then at the same time, you talk about, or at least bring up in the documentary, that as Attorney General, he signed the wiretaps for the FBI.
He wasn't completely baked.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that that's fascinating, and I think it's great that you bring that into this, because he is only remembered, I think, often as this, already committed to these ideals by the time that he was committed to when he passed away. When he wasn't, and it was a process. It was always a process for him to learn.
That's right. And he also, so he's the person who probably saved King's life. Many people thought King would have been another Black man beaten in jail. And so getting him out probably saved his life. But then he does authorize, wiretapping on King, and this, COINTELPRO, and kind of like going into his, personal life. So, I think like that was also really just has influenced me in thinking, change is a process, and our beliefs are a process. And anybody who has a belief and doesn't ever want to have them challenged, kind of, there's no maturity in that. Absolutely. So,
let's get some questions from our audience. Who's a question?
Hi. So when you were going through film, how did you choose what you wanted to use? Like, were there multiple sources of the same takes, or did you have like one source?
Oh, we used film from over 100 sources in this. Actually, we used film from 75 sources. We had access to about 150 different sources of footage and options. One of the things that had happened is, as I said, the news networks were just starting this process of doing, kind of coverage, but there were also all of these independent filmmakers. So, historically famous filmmakers like Robert Drew or D.A. Pennebaker, they were following Bobby around, follow me around. And so I went to like D.A. Pennebaker's his office, and his partner Chris showed me around, and D.A. Pennebaker, if you don't know, made the famous film The War Room, just historic, like seminal documentaries, and being in their office.
Back too, right?
Don't Look Back, yeah. So she gave me a tour, and then she hands me this drive, and she's like, "Here it is. I don't know what you're going to do with, Bobby Kennedy singing Jingle Bells like at a school." And we were like, we love that footage. So what we did is,
that's like gold.
Yeah,
for a documentary
I was
filmmaker.
like, I love it. Like Sammy Davis Jr. is taking pictures, and like for some reason, and he's singing Jingle Bells with his kids. So what we did is we wrote like a treatise, like a history, long, tens and tens and tens of pages. Great producer Elizabeth Wolf like read every single thing, and then we started our documentary footage gathering, and we're figuring, okay, what do we have to cover some of these stories, some of the highlights, and very quickly it became clear there had to be like a motivating question. Bobby Kennedy's just too big of a story. It's too big of a time. You can't do everything. So, my question was, what does this particular story tell us about his movement as a person, his growth and change, or about the era? Is there something where we can see change, we can see a difference? And so those were the stories we were looking for. And then also like what was beautiful, because I think it's a film. It has to be immersive. You have to be able to watch it and enjoy it. It's not just it's not a book report. So it's a great question, thanks.
One more.
Hi, so when you were making the documentary, was it difficult for you to, step away from your own beliefs while at the same time trying to, showcase a story within the narrative?
So we're not news reporters, documentary people, right? And I think that's a common misconception is it's a documentary. People think like it's like you're reading the New York Times. But every person comes to a story with their own set of eyes, with their own lens, which is why we need people of all races and genders and political perspectives making films, because they bring something of themselves into that process. And I think you see here, I'm like, it's the blackest Bobby Kennedy ever. Like that's what I was drawn to those stories about Cesar Chavez, et cetera. But it's not really, this is a historical piece, so it's not really difficult. It is difficult. I've made films before where I made a film about public defenders working in the Deep South. I made a film about abortion providers. And I think it's really important to, if you have a bias, to be open about it, to say, I am pro-choice, I'm making this movie, so that people know where the viewer can evaluate the material. I believe but also I like verite, follow people around stories. So I feel like if you do your job right, people see why you believe what you believe, or they see for themselves. So I don't really like, lecture-y kind of like nobody likes to be lectured to. And audiences are very sophisticated. You know, they know, you know, dun-dun-dun-dun music means you're supposed to be like something big's happening, you know, come back from the bath, you know. So it's not that hard. I think the goal is to be transparent, you know, as transparent as possible. So.
Don, it's incredible work. Congratulations. The 4-part series is on Netflix today.
It is. Today is the first day of streaming Bobby Kennedy for President on Netflix series. So thank you so much for having us.
Of course, congratulations. It's a really fantastic. It's thrilling actually to watch. It is in no way does it feel kind of staged.
What did you say it was? It was
thrilling.
It was thrilling.
Thrilling. I mean,
I heard you the first time. I just wanted you to say it aloud.
I have to watch a lot of documentaries. I have to watch a lot of series, and it's not often that you put one on and immediately go, "Oh, this is by filmmakers who care about being entertaining as well as telling a great story."
A great editor, Josh Pearson, who made What Happened, Miss Simone. So, you know, when you get an Oscar-nominated editor, like
I think you had something to do with it too. Don Porter, everybody, let's hear it.